No one at Halden Care Nursing Facility was willing to fight for the man in the wheelchair in the room at the far end of the hall. The doctors called him a hopeless case. The administrators called him a burden to be moved along, out of sight. And the staff called him dangerous, because though the lower half of his body had gone silent, and his hands only trembled against the wheels of his chair, his eyes still fixed on people with a coldness that left them feeling judged. Only one person believed his silence was not surrender. A waitress, nearly 7 months pregnant, who had taken on night cleaning shifts here just to gather enough money for the day her child would come. That night, she was pushing her cleaning cart past his door, at the very moment he forced out 2 broken syllables through lips that had nearly lost all feeling, 2 syllables that not a soul on the night shift could understand. She froze in the dim corridor, her hand still gripping the damp cloth, because she had heard those words before. A year earlier, on the night she had held on with all her strength to the life of a faceless stranger, on an emergency room table, a man she was never supposed to meet again, she stepped closer, leaned down to his ear, and softly she answered him with the exact 3 words that in all this world, only the 2 of them were ever meant to know. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, share it, and subscribe to our channel to walk alongside the stories still to come. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ambrose Hall began to glow with light, and Clara Whitmore had been on her feet since noon. She placed a hand against the dull ache in her lower back, let out a soft breath, then lifted her tray and kept moving. Her belly, nearly 7 months along, made every turn through the rows of tables a little longer than it was for the other waitresses, but she never let anyone see her slow down. In this place, slowing down meant being replaced. With her white apron tied high above her stomach and her brown hair tucked neatly behind her ears, she moved among the elegantly dressed diners like a quiet, careful shadow, pouring wine, clearing plates, smiling at exactly the right moment, and disappearing at exactly the right moment. In the pocket of her apron was a folded sheet of paper, worn soft at the edges. It was the hospital bill from her most recent prenatal appointment, and the bold number printed at the bottom made her count it over and over in her head every time she carried a heavy tray. There was next month's rent too, and the payment on the old car, and the sum that frightened her most of all, the money she needed for the day the baby would be born. Her husband had been gone for 4 months, and ever since then, every number in her life seemed to double the weight it placed on her shoulders. The evening shift manager called her into the corner of the kitchen, just as Clara set her tray down. The woman glanced briefly at Clara's belly, then lowered her voice and said there was a place that needed someone to clean during the night shift, Halden Care, a nursing facility at the end of the street. It paid by the hour, and the work started after Clara finished here. The job wouldn't be easy, but they paid fairly. She asked Clara whether she could handle it. Clara didn't hesitate for long. She thought of the paper in her pocket. She thought of the crib she still didn't have enough money to buy. Then she nodded. She said she could manage it. Her voice was small but steady, the voice of a woman who had grown used to convincing herself that she could endure just a little more. She returned to the dining room, and that was when it happened. An older man seated at table number 9 suddenly shot to his feet, both hands clutching at his throat, his face turning a frightening shade of purplish red. He couldn't make a sound. Everyone at the table around him froze. Someone cried out. Another person struck his back a few times, uselessly. In the moment when everyone else was still panicking and staring at one another, Clara's body moved before her mind had time to think. She set down her tray, stepped behind him, wrapped her arms around the upper part of the man's abdomen, tightened her grip, and drove upward with one firm, decisive thrust, so clean and practiced that no one watching had time to understand how skillful it was. Once, the piece of food flew out. The man dragged in a long breath, then began coughing violently and collapsed back into his chair, alive again. The whole restaurant applauded. But Clara had already stepped back. She bent down, picked up her tray, murmured a few words saying that he was all right now, that he should drink a little water, and withdrew toward the back as though she were the one who had just done something wrong. Her hand still held the memory of that movement, a memory that didn't belong to an ordinary waitress. The manager watched her go, her gaze lingering a little longer than usual, but she didn't ask anything. Clara didn't explain either. There are parts of a life people bury, not because they're ashamed, but because they hurt. When her shift ended close to 11 o'clock at night, she didn't go home. She pulled her thin coat tighter to cover her belly and stepped out onto the cold street of Chicago in late autumn, where the wind blowing in from the lake cut straight to the bone. Halden Care stood 3 blocks away, a low gray building with rows of windows glowing a sickly yellow. Clara stood before the entrance for a moment, one hand resting on her stomach as though reassuring the child inside her that its mother was only going to work another job. That was all, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Inside, they handed her a cart loaded with cleaning cloths, disinfectant, and gloves, showed her the hallway she was supposed to clean, and left her alone. No one told her about the patients in the rooms. No one warned her which doors she should avoid. Clara pushed the cart down the silent corridor, its wheels squeaking beneath the long strips of light falling across the floor, and began her first shift in that place, without knowing that in the very last room, a man she had once saved a year earlier was sitting in the dark, waiting for a voice he had believed he would never hear again. The first night passed slowly, until Clara pushed the cleaning cart toward the far end of the hallway. There, in front of the door to the last room, a group of people in white coats had gathered, and she stopped, pressing herself close to the wall, with the instinct of someone who had learned how to make herself invisible. The man standing at the center of the group had neatly combed silver hair and the calm bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders, while the others listened to him with a mixture of respect and unease. He was Dr. Aldous Frey. He held a folder in his hand and spoke in a flat voice, as though he were reading a weather report, saying that the patient in this room no longer had any chance of recovering motor function, that any further therapy would only be a waste of resources, and that the paperwork should be prepared to move him to a long-term care facility as soon as possible. He said all of it right there before the open doorway, well within earshot of the man sitting inside. Clara looked through the crack in the door. In the dim light, a man sat in a wheelchair facing the window, a thin blanket spread across the motionless lower half of his body, his 2 hands resting on his thighs and trembling in small waves he couldn't seem to stop. But what made her go still wasn't the ruin of that body. It was his face. He didn't lower his head. He didn't close his eyes to escape the words being spoken, as though he were no longer there. He only turned his head slowly, with painful effort, until his gaze met Dr. Frey's directly, and there was no pleading in that gaze, no fear, only something so cold and sharp that Frey stopped speaking for half a second before continuing, like a man who had accidentally touched something razor-edged in the dark. Beside Frey stood another man, tall and broad, wearing a carefully tailored dark suit. He wasn't wearing a white coat and didn't belong to the medical staff. He stood slightly behind the others, his hands folded in front of him, his face carrying a courteous smile that never reached his eyes. Clara heard Frey call him Kessler. The man named Kessler bent down beside the wheelchair, placed one hand on the paralyzed man's shoulder with a carefully staged show of familiarity, and said in a voice so warm it turned cold that he shouldn't worry, that everything would be arranged properly, that he only needed to rest and let everyone else take care of what had to be done. The man in the wheelchair didn't answer. He only looked at the hand resting on his shoulder, then lifted his eyes straight to Kessler's face, and though he didn't say a single word, something in that look made Kessler's smile stiffen for a moment before he managed to shape it back into place. Clara understood, with the kind of instinct that years beside hospital beds had honed inside her, that the scene before her wasn't a medical examination. It was a sentencing, and they were reading the sentence in front of the condemned man to make sure he heard every word. She had seen enough in life to recognize when one human being was being quietly erased by others, and she was witnessing exactly that right here, in the dark hallway of a place that was supposed to exist so people could be healed. The group dispersed. Frey closed the folder and told a nurse to update the notes, to say there had been no significant progress, and to continue passive physical therapy for form's sake. Kessler left last, and when he passed the place where Clara was bending her head and wiping at an imaginary mark on the floor, his eyes slid over her for 1 second, registering her presence before dismissing it at once, exactly the way people dismissed a piece of furniture. She was only the cleaning woman. She wasn't worth worrying about, and Clara, who had learned that invisibility was sometimes the best shield, let him think so. When the hallway was empty, she straightened, rubbed her aching lower back, and let her eyes drift again toward the open door. The man in the room had turned back toward the window, leaving only his back and the still line of his neck in the yellow light. She should pushed the cart on. She should remembered that she had come here to mop floors, not to get entangled in the affairs of dangerous men in expensive suits. But something about the way that man had lifted his head and endured his own sentence without lowering it once had lodged in her chest as a feeling she couldn't name, and she stood there longer than she should have, looking toward the room at the end of the hallway, not yet knowing that she had already begun to step into a story far larger than a night shift spent cleaning floors. The following night, while Clara was rinsing several cleaning cloths in the staff restroom, a young nurse named Dana came in and lit a cigarette by the cracked open window. When she saw Clara looking toward the end of the hallway, she let out a soft laugh, then lowered her voice as though telling a story that should only ever be whispered. Dana told her not to go anywhere near that room. The man inside wasn't an ordinary kind of man. She said people whispered that he had once held half the harbor district in his hands, that the men who dared stand in his way vanished without leaving a trace, that the police had wanted to bring him down for years and had never once managed to so much as touch the hem of his coat. Then a few months ago he'd been in a car accident. Dana said the words car accident with a curl of her mouth that showed even she didn't believe them, and ever since then he had ended up like this, trapped in one place, unable to walk, barely able to speak. She said the people here called him the Beast, not because he screamed or broke things, but because he just sat there in silence and looked at people with eyes that made their skin crawl, as though he were memorizing every face so that one day he could settle accounts. Dana drew in a breath of smoke, then concluded that a smart person cleaned the room quickly and never looked him straight in the eye. Clara said nothing. She wrung out the cloths and stacked them on the cart, but the words she had just heard stayed lodged in her mind all evening. Close to midnight, when she pushed the cart past the last room to mop the stretch of floor outside the door, she looked inside again, and this time what made her stop wasn't the man's eyes, but the way he was breathing. His chest was rising and falling a beat faster than normal, unevenly, and beneath the skin of his cheekbones, an unnatural flush had begun to appear, spreading slowly toward his temples, while his neck and shoulders were beaded with sweat even though the room was rather cold. Her eyes, the eyes that had once read hundreds of human bodies through long, intense nights on duty, registered each sign automatically without needing her to command them. Something was wrong, and it was beginning slowly. Right now. She should have gone to call a nurse. She should have remembered Dana's warning. But her feet had already carried her across the threshold, and she moved closer to the wheelchair, bent down until she was level with his eyes. Suddenly, the man forced out two broken, agonizing syllables through his trembling lips, a sound no one else would have understood, but it made Clara freeze. The soothing words came out of her as naturally as breath, carrying with them an old habit that belonged to the person she had tried to bury long ago. Without thinking, she leaned closer and whispered the exact phrase from that fateful night. "Count with me." And while she spoke, something changed on the man's face. The cold eyes Dana had warned her about, the eyes that made an entire nursing facility look away, slowly lifted to find her face, and when they touched her, they were no longer the eyes of a man judging everyone around him. They widened in a way she couldn't understand, fastening on her with an intense and almost desperate attention, as though that voice had awakened something buried deep inside him, something he had believed was gone. His breathing slowed with her words. The flush on his cheekbones eased, and he kept looking at her with such fixed concentration that Clara grew flustered and had to turn her face away. That was when she heard shoes against the floor behind her. Kessler stood in the doorway. No one knew how long he had been there, one hand still resting on the doorknob, his eyes moving from the changed face of the man in the wheelchair to the cleaning girl bent beside him. And this time, his gaze didn't slide over her and dismiss her the way it had the night before. This time it stayed. He looked at her longer than anyone should look at a cleaning worker, like a man who had just noticed that a chess piece he had never bothered to consider was sitting in the wrong place on the board. Then he gave her that familiar courteous smile and asked, in a sweet voice, whether she was new here and what her name was. Clara straightened, pulled the cloth toward herself, and answered softly that she was only the night cleaning woman, that she had seen the room was untidy and come in to clean, and that she would like to continue her work. Kessler nodded, still smiling, but as she pushed the cart out of the room, she could feel his eyes clinging to her all the way down the hall, and she knew, with a coldness running along her spine, that the cloak of invisibility she had worn around herself for so long had just been seen through by someone. Once she was safely out of Kessler's sight and reached a hidden corner, the delayed shock finally hit her. Clara felt her whole body go weak, and she backed away from the wheelchair so quickly she nearly bumped into the cart behind her, both hands closing around her pregnant belly in a reflex of protection. She didn't dare look at the man's face for even one more second. She grabbed the handle, turned, and moved almost at a run down the hallway, the clatter of the wheels sounding lonely in the stillness, until she reached a hidden corner where no one could see her. There she stopped, leaned her back against the cold wall, and pressed a hand to her chest, trying to hold down the frantic beating of her heart. She had recognized him, and more frightening than that, he had recognized her. Not by her face, because that night he hadn't been conscious enough to remember a face, but by her voice, by that very low, steady voice she had just used by accident to calm him, the voice that had once been the only thread holding him on this side of life. That night came back to her not in order, only in sharp, glaring fragments rushing up all at once. A man being wheeled into the emergency room in the middle of the night, with no papers, no name. His shirt dark with blood, his blood pressure plunging without slowing. The co-workers around her shaking their heads. People saying he had lost too much blood. People saying to prepare to let him go. But she hadn't let go. She had climbed onto the stretcher and driven her whole weight down to press against the wound spurting blood, and when his eyes began to glaze over, she had bent close and told him not to disappear, told him to count with her, and then she counted backward, her voice cutting through the chaos of the machines, pulling him back one number at a time. He had lived, and he had never known who she was, until tonight. Clara stood in the corner of the hallway for a very long time, one hand still resting on her belly, and inside her mind was a struggle with no way out. She told herself this had nothing to do with her anymore, that the woman she had been 1 year ago had died along with the profession she had left behind, that the woman standing here now was only a waitress and a hired cleaner, a widow about to become a mother, with no authority, and not enough strength to get tangled in the affairs of people even the police couldn't touch. She thought of the child inside her, thought of how she would pay for the day it was born if she lost this job, thought of Kessler's eyes following her earlier, and of the cold feeling down her spine when the invisible cloak around her was seen through. Every argument in her head told her to turn away, to finish mopping the rest of the floor, to go home, and tomorrow to stay far away from the last room at the end of the hallway as if she had never stepped inside it. But reason was one thing, and the thing tightening inside her chest was another. Because she had seen his face change when he heard her voice. She had seen those eyes, the same eyes that terrified the entire nursing facility, suddenly open to something almost like a plea for help. And she understood very clearly, with the part of herself she had never been able to kill, no matter how hard she had tried, that the man in that room was being quietly pushed toward death, and he knew it. And after so many months sunk in silence, he had just found the only person in this building who might understand him. She closed her eyes, rested her head against the wall, and whispered to herself that she couldn't, that she mustn't, that this time she had to know when to stop. She repeated it over and over until even she no longer believed it. Then she opened her eyes, looked down at her hands, at the hands that still remembered the feeling of holding on to a life that was slipping away. And she understood that no matter how many times she told herself otherwise, tomorrow morning she would still return to that room. She had never truly been capable of walking away from someone who was drowning. It was both the most beautiful and the most dangerous thing about her. Just as she had known she would, the following night Clara pushed her cart back toward the end of the hallway, and she arrived just in time. The moment she came close to the door, she heard an unusual choked groan from inside, and when she looked in, she saw the man in the wheelchair with his head tipped back, his face flushed a fierce red that spread across his forehead and both cheekbones, while sweat poured heavily over his neck and shoulders, his two hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. But what made Clara go cold all over was that the lower half of his body was completely dry, without a single drop of sweat, as though his body had been split into two halves belonging to two different worlds. And that sign, that strange boundary running across his chest, told her exactly what this was. This wasn't an ordinary panic attack. This was a dangerous nervous system reaction in someone with a spinal cord injury. Something that could drive blood pressure so high it could rupture a blood vessel in the brain within minutes if no one handled it. And from the way the two veins at his temples were swelling, she knew she didn't have much time. There was a nurse on duty standing right there in the room, holding a chart, and when Clara rushed in, the woman only shrugged and said he was having another spell of agitation. Leave him alone for a while, and it would pass on its own. Dr. Frey had said there was no need to do much with this case. Clara didn't waste words arguing. She placed 2 fingers against his neck to check his pulse, and the frantic, irregular pounding beneath her fingertips confirmed her fear. She turned sharply to the nurse and spoke in a voice she herself hadn't heard from herself in a long time, low, clear, without a trace of timidity left in it, telling her to raise the back of the chair at once and get his head as high as possible. The nurse froze, staring at the cleaning woman who had just given her an order, and before she could react, Clara had already pushed the back of the wheelchair upright herself, positioning him so that his head was elevated and his legs were lowered, the only position that could help bring down the blood that was surging upward toward his brain. Then she worked quickly and cleanly, her 2 hands moving with a certainty that made the nurse beside her fall silent. She loosened his collar, pulled the blanket away from his legs, and swept her eyes over his body, searching for the cause that had triggered this reaction, because she knew episodes like this always had a spark somewhere below the line of paralysis, something causing distress that he couldn't feel and couldn't say aloud. She asked the nurse when his urinary catheter had last been changed, and when she received a stammered answer that the woman wasn't sure. Perhaps during the morning shift, Clara understood. The tube was blocked, his bladder was distending, and his body had no way to signal it except by sending his blood pressure sky high. She handled the catheter with steady hands, cleared the blockage, and almost at once she felt the change beneath the fingers resting on his neck. The wild pulse began to slow, easing down. The red in his face faded. The sweat stopped pouring out, and the man exhaled one long breath as though he had just been lifted out of an invisible hand clamped around his throat. Clara kept her hand on his neck for a while longer, counting his pulse until she was sure it had returned to an even rhythm, and only then did she lift her head and meet his eyes watching her. This time, there wasn't only the attention she had seen on the previous nights. There was something almost like astonishment, and beneath it, a silent gratitude that a man like him probably wouldn't have known how to express in words even when he had still been able to speak. She was about to say something when a voice from the doorway cut through everything. Dr. Frey was standing there, and beside him was Kessler, both of them having arrived at some point without her knowing. Frey stepped inside, his face tight with irritation, asking who had given a sanitation worker permission to touch a patient, asking who she thought she was to dare interfere in medical care on her own. Clara took one step back, lowered her head, and in that instant she felt her old cloak of invisibility hurriedly settle over her shoulders again. She mumbled that she had only seen he was having trouble breathing, so she helped him sit upright, that was all. But it was too late to pretend. Frey looked at the position she had placed the patient in, looked at the catheter she had handled, and she saw a flash of cold caution pass through his eyes, the look of a man who had just discovered that the pawn on his chessboard wasn't nearly as simple as he had thought. As for Kessler, he said nothing at all. He only stood leaning against the doorframe, arms folded across his chest, watching Clara with that ever-present courteous smile on his lips, but his eyes were fully awake now, and she knew that from tonight on, he would no longer see her as a shadow. The following morning, just as Clara arrived to sign in on the timesheet for the night shift, someone told her to go up and see Dr. Frey in his office, and she walked in with the heavy instinct that what had happened the night before wouldn't end with a single frown. Frey sat behind a polished wooden desk and didn't invite her to sit, leaving her standing there with her pregnant belly and legs already aching after a long night. Then he folded the file in front of him and looked at her with the eyes of a man used to looking down on other people from above. He said he didn't know what she had done for work before, and he didn't care, but in this facility, there were clear boundaries, and a sanitation worker taking it upon herself to touch a patient was something that could cost her job immediately, even bring legal trouble down on her if anything went wrong. He emphasized that the patient in the last room at the end of the hallway was a special case, cared for under a separate protocol that he personally supervised, and that she was absolutely not to go anywhere near that room again, not to clean it, not to look inside, not for any reason at all. Clara lowered her head and answered softly that she understood, that she was sorry, but even as those obedient words left her mouth, a part of her was quietly taking in the strange things inside the room. On Frey's desk, among the medical papers, she caught sight of a folder that didn't look anything like a patient chart, pages filled densely with numbers and lines of text, and she managed to skim a few words before he turned it face down. Words like ownership, asset portfolio, transfer. That wasn't the kind of thing a treating physician needed on his desk, and at that exact moment his phone began to vibrate. He glanced quickly at the screen, then turned the phone face down on the desk and told her, in a voice that had hardened, that this conversation was over, that she could go. He waited until she had stepped completely outside before picking up the phone, but through the door that hadn't fully closed, she still heard him lower his voice and say that it wasn't done yet, that they needed more time, and the only name she heard before the door shut was not a name she had expected. She stood in the hallway for a moment, her heart beating slow and heavy, and tucked that small piece away in a corner of her mind, without yet knowing what picture it belonged to. She knew she should obey. She knew this job was the only thing standing between her and the unthinkable vision of the day her child was born, while there wasn't a single dollar left in her pocket. But that night, as she pushed her cart down the hallway, her feet slowed again in front of the last room, and although Frey's threat still rang in her ears, she glanced inside anyway, just once, only to make sure he was all right. The man was sitting turned toward the door as though he had been waiting for her, and when he saw her, he moved his right hand slightly where it rested on his thigh, that frail, trembling hand for which every motion demanded all his effort. He shifted his eyes toward the stack of napkins on the bedside table, then looked back at her, repeating the movement, and Clara understood. She looked around the empty hallway, then stepped inside and placed a sheet of paper and a pen into his palm. It took him a long while, his fingers struggling with the pen as if it weighed as much as an iron bar, his handwriting crooked, broken, shaking so badly it was almost unreadable. But when he finally finished and Clara bent down to look, she saw only one word on the page, written with all the remaining strength of a man who had once made an entire city show him respect. One brief word that sent a coldness down her spine the moment she read it. Run. He had written the word run for her. He lifted his eyes to look at her, and in them there was no plea for himself, only a warning meant for her, urgent and grave, as though the thing he feared most now wasn't the death waiting for him, but that the woman carrying a living child inside her would be dragged down with him into the abyss he had already seen ahead. Clara straightened, the paper trembling faintly in her hand, and she looked at the man the whole building called the Beast, the man who had just used the little strength he had left not to beg for rescue, but to tell her to save herself. And she knew, in that very second, that she wasn't going to run anywhere. That trembling handwriting haunted Clara for 2 days, until one evening, as she was walking from Ambrose Hall to the nursing facility, an older man stepped out of the darkness beside the parking lot, and she startled backward, one hand closing over her belly, until he lifted both hands to show he meant her no harm. He was past 60, broad-shouldered, his close-cut hair already streaked with gray, wearing an old worn coat, and though his posture still held the steadiness of a man once accustomed to work that demanded strength, his eyes now carried a quiet sorrow. He introduced himself as Otto and said he had been watching her for the past few nights, that he knew she was the one who had saved his boss from the crisis the night before. Clara was about to deny it, about to say she was only the cleaning woman, but Otto shook his head and told her there was no need to hide it, because in that building, she was the only person left who truly wanted him to live. Otto told her, in the low voice of a man who had kept faith with another human being for almost his entire life, that he had once been Elias Thornbury's driver and bodyguard for many years, and that from the day his boss was struck down, nearly everyone who had once bowed their heads before him had slowly turned away, drifting toward the man who now held power, leaving only a few who still believed, and those few had been pushed out from every door. Otto said he had tried everything to visit him, but they kept him outside, giving every excuse they could find, and he knew very well it wasn't hospital policy but Kessler's order, because Kessler wanted his boss completely cut off from the outside world, so no one could hear what he wanted to say. Then he looked straight into Clara's eyes and told her what he truly needed, that he couldn't get inside, but she could, and that if she was willing, she should help him pass a message to Elias, just one short sentence, that the ones who remained were still waiting for orders, and that the southern route was still open. Clara hesitated. She understood that agreeing meant stepping one step deeper into the place she had told herself she had to stay away from. But she thought of the crooked word run on that piece of paper, and of the warning in that man's eyes, and then she nodded. That night, she slipped into his room while the hallway was empty, bent down as though adjusting his blanket, and softly spoke into his ear exactly the words Otto had given her. She saw something light inside Elias's eyes when he heard them, not joy but a cold, sharp calculation, the gaze of a man who, though his body had been nailed to a chair, was still moving pieces inside his mind at a speed his enemies couldn't imagine. He signaled for her to bring paper and pen, and this time he wrote more slowly, trying with all his strength to make the words clear enough. A short sentence asking her to carry a reply back to Otto. An instruction Clara read without fully understanding its meaning, though she could feel its weight. She could feel that she had just become the only line of communication between an imprisoned boss and the remaining piece of his empire that was still holding its breath, waiting for him. 2 days later, she witnessed something she would remember forever. Kessler entered Elias's room with his usual confidence, a stack of papers in his hand, and began speaking in that falsely sweet voice, saying it was time for his boss to think about arranging everything neatly, that there were a few documents he needed to sign so things could proceed smoothly. Elias let him finish. Then, very slowly, with lips that still struggled to obey him, he spoke a single sentence, only a few words, a name and a location Clara couldn't understand as she stood wiping the corner of the room, but she saw the effect clearly. Kessler froze. The smile on his lips hardened. The stack of papers in his hand dipped slightly, and for one brief moment, that always composed face revealed a flash of real panic before he managed to hide it. He looked at the man sitting motionless in the wheelchair. The man he had believed was entirely in the palm of his hand, and for the first time, Clara saw something in his eyes she had never seen there before. It was fear. Elias said nothing more. He only sat there, the lower half of his body dead still, his hands trembling. And yet he looked at the man who had betrayed him with the eyes of a lion, whose legs had been broken, but who had never stopped being king. And Clara understood that this man was nowhere close to surrendering, that the war inside this building had only just truly begun. Not every face at Halden Care was as cold as Frey's or as false as Kessler's, and Clara came to realize that because of Beth Callahan, a dedicated nurse in her 40s who often covered late shift changes, with an easy smile, and the eyes of someone who had lived through many hardships, and somehow still kept her kindness. She often pressed a cup of hot coffee into Clara's hand during shift change, asked how many weeks along her pregnancy was, and reminded her not to lift the heavy buckets of disinfectant, but to ask someone else for help. One late afternoon, when their shifts happened to overlap, Beth drew her over to the long bench in the waiting area, said she had something she wanted to give her, then took from her bag a tiny pale yellow sweater, hand-knitted, every stitch neat and careful, made by someone who had poured many evenings into it. Beth told her she had knitted it herself for Clara's baby, said Chicago winters were cruel, and a newborn needed to be kept warm. She said it simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to do for a woman, trying to manage alone in the middle of life. Clara held the little sweater in her hands, and her throat tightened. It had been such a long time since anyone had done something for her, without asking for anything in return, and that unexpected kindness nearly made her break down right there in the lobby. She had to blink quickly and lower her head to stroke the soft wool, hiding the emotion rising in her chest. Just then, a little girl about 6 years old came running into the lobby, her hair tied in 2 bouncing pigtails, and threw herself into Beth's lap, calling her mommy. Beth introduced her as June, her daughter. When the little girl saw the sweater in Clara's hands, she cried out proudly that she had chosen that yellow herself, because yellow was like the sun, and when the baby wore it, The baby would always feel warm as if there were sunlight around. June asked Clara when the baby would be born, and whether she could come visit the baby, spilling out the questions in a clear, innocent voice that made both Clara and Beth laugh. And for one brief moment, the cold hallway of Halden Care seemed to grow warm with the laughter of a child. Clara bent down to the little girl's height, thanked her for choosing such a beautiful color, and promised that when the baby was born, she would absolutely let June come visit. The child's eyes lit up at that promise. Beth watched her daughter run over to the chair by the window and sit down to draw, then turned back to Clara, and her smile softened with a slight sadness as she lowered her voice and began to confide in her. Beth told her that June had been born with a heart problem, that she had gone through a major surgery last year, and that seeing her healthy and cheerful like this now was something Beth was grateful for every single day. But the price of it had been a mountain of medical bills she was still slowly paying off, month after month, always behind, one debt paid only for another to appear. Beth said she wasn't complaining, that as long as the little girl could still laugh the way she had today, every dollar was worth it. But there were nights when she lay awake calculating, couldn't sleep. And sometimes she felt as though she were standing on a thin sheet of ice, where one unexpected thing would be enough to make everything shatter. Clara listened, then placed her hand over Beth's, because she understood that feeling far too well, the feeling of standing on thin ice, the feeling that every number in her life doubled its own weight. The two women sat together in the fading afternoon light, one about to become a mother, and the other carrying the full burden of being one, sharing a silence of understanding that needed no more words. While by the window, little June kept carefully drawing a great big yellow sun on a white sheet of paper. Clara held the little sweater against her chest and told herself that no matter how harsh life became, there were still people willing to knit a warm sweater for the child of a stranger, and that very thing, that small but stubborn light of goodness, was what allowed women like her to keep walking forward through one long night after another. One evening, the aide responsible for Elias's meal said she had a family matter and needed to leave early, and because no one else was willing to take on the task with the man the entire building feared, Beth quietly asked Clara to help bring the dinner tray into the last room at the end of the hallway. Clara carried the tray in, set it down on the table beside the bed, and understood at once that this would not be an easy trial for the man sitting before her. Elias looked at the bowl of porridge, looked at the spoon, then looked at his own trembling hands, and she saw his jaw tighten. He tried to lift the spoon, his fingers struggling to hold it, but halfway up, his whole hand began to shake violently, the spoon tilted, and porridge spilled down the front of his shirt. Then he tried again, with the same result. Clara stood still, understanding that being watched was itself a humiliation for a man like him, so she stepped forward gently, took the spoon, and said softly that she would help. The moment the spoonful of porridge reached his lips, the thing she had feared happened. Elias jerked his head sharply to one side, and his whole arm swung up in an effort that spent what little strength he had left, knocking the tray clean off the table. The bowl of porridge, the glass of water, and the spoon crashed noisily onto the floor, porridge splattering across the white tile. The room fell into silence, with only the sound of his heavy breathing left behind. He didn't look at her. He turned his face toward the dark window, and Clara saw that the man's whole body was trembling, not because of illness, but because of a pain far deeper than that. The shame of a human being who had once held the power of life and death over an entire district, a man whose entrance into any room had once made others bow their heads, now unable to bring even one spoonful of porridge to his own mouth, forced to let a strange woman feed him as if she were feeding a child. He would rather starve than endure that, and in that moment, the cold gaze that terrified the entire building broke open and revealed beneath it a man slowly dying from the loss of his dignity. Clara didn't offer a single word of comfort. She didn't rush to say it was all right, and she didn't show pity, because she understood that for a man like him, pity was more brutal than hunger. She only quietly knelt on the floor, picked up each broken piece of the bowl, wiped the spilled porridge from the tile, slowly and calmly, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world, as though she had cleaned up such breakage 1,000 times in her life without judging any of it. She worked in silence, giving him time, letting the room find its breath again. Then, when the floor was clean, she stood, pulled a chair over, and sat down at his eye level, not above him, not looking down on him. In a calm but certain voice, she said she knew he didn't need her help, that she knew there had been a time when no one in this world would have dared lay a hand on him, and that she understood having to let someone touch him this way was harder for him than enduring pain. She paused for a moment, then went on more softly, saying that letting another person help you when you were weak wasn't surrender, and that he had survived the night when he should have died, so he had no right to let himself wither away here because of pride. The man turned his head back, and for the first time since Clara had entered this building, she saw those cold eyes shine with tears. He didn't weep aloud. A man like him had probably forgotten how to do that a very long time ago. But one tear quietly rolled down his deeply lined cheek, and he looked at her, at the pregnant woman sitting on the old chair before him, the woman who had saved his life twice and asked for nothing, the woman who spoke to him the words none of the men under him had dared say in all those years. He tried to move his lips, and after a long struggle, in the hoarse, broken voice of someone who hadn't used speech in a very long time, he managed to force out 2 words, asking her why. Why was she doing all these things for someone like him, someone the whole city called a monster? Clara looked at him for a long while, then answered simply that because on that night in the emergency room she hadn't seen a monster. She had only seen a human being trying to hold on to life, and to her, a human being was always worth having someone fight for, no matter who they were. Then she took the spoon again from the spare tray, scooped up a fresh spoonful of porridge, and this time, when she brought it to him, the man who had once made an entire district tremble gently closed his eyes, and he let her help, that afternoon. Just Clara stepped out of the prenatal clinic with the ultrasound still in her hand. A strange man waiting outside called her name, and she stopped, wary at once. He was around 50, tall and thin, wearing an old overcoat, his face carved with the weary lines of a man who had spent too many nights awake, and he introduced himself as Deacon Vale, a former detective with the city police department before his retirement. He said right away that he knew this would upset her, that he was sorry to approach her at a time like this, but there was something he had been investigating for the past several months that he couldn't bring himself to leave unfinished, and it was directly connected to her husband. Just hearing that made Clara's whole body go rigid, her hand tightening around the ultrasound, because for the past 4 months she had tried with all her strength not to speak of that day, the day someone had knocked on her door to tell her that her husband had fallen to the bottom of the elevator shaft at the construction site where he worked. A workplace accident, they had said. An unfortunate incident. The file closed cleanly and quickly, and she had carried that grief alone ever since. Vale asked if she could give him 10 minutes, and they sat down on a stone bench in the small park across the street, beneath the bare branches of late autumn trees. He opened his worn leather briefcase, took out several papers, and began speaking in the careful voice of a man who had weighed every word. He said that what people had called an accident contained details he couldn't explain, that the elevator safety system that day should have been working but had somehow been disabled, that the surveillance footage from that area had vanished from the file in a way no one could properly account for, and that her husband, based on everything he had been able to uncover, had no reason to be in the elevator work area at that hour of the evening. He stopped, looked straight into Clara's eyes, and said the thing he had hesitated a long time before deciding to say aloud, that in his judgment, her husband's death was not an accident. Clara sat frozen for a long time. The ultrasound in her hand trembled faintly, and she felt a coldness rise inside her chest, the same feeling she had spent the past 4 months trying to bury so deeply, because she hadn't dared let it surface, because she knew that once it did, she would no longer be able to live quietly with the story of an accident that had been handed to her. In a hoarse voice, she asked Vale why he was pursuing this, who had hired him, and Vale shook his head, saying no one had hired him at all, that this had been the last case he worked before being forced into retirement, and that they had pressured him to close it before he could find the truth. And for months now, the feeling that he had abandoned an innocent man had haunted him so badly he couldn't sit still. He said he was old, that he didn't have much left to lose, and that he only wanted, for once in his life, to carry the right thing through to the end. Vale stood, left her a piece of paper with his phone number on it, and told her that if she was willing to talk, if she remembered anything unusual in the days before her husband died, she should call him. But he also warned her to be extremely careful, because people capable of making a piece of footage disappear and closing an investigation file were not ordinary people. Then he walked away, leaving Clara sitting alone on the cold stone bench, with the ultrasound of her unborn child in one hand and the slip of paper bearing an investigator's phone number in the other. She looked down at her pregnant belly, thought of the husband who would never get to see his child's face, and for the first time since the day he died, the dull ache inside her began to turn into something else, something sharper and hotter, a question beating again and again inside her mind. If it wasn't an accident, then who had done this, and why? She didn't yet know that the answer to that question was waiting for her in the very last room at the end of the hallway she entered every night, and that her fate, her husband's fate, and the fate of the man in the wheelchair had been bound tightly together by threads she still couldn't see. Clara called Vale the very next evening, and they agreed to meet at a small out-of-the-way cafe a few blocks from the nursing facility, where the yellow light and the noise of the regular customers were enough for the two of them to sit and talk without fearing anyone would pay attention. She told him what she had witnessed at Halden Care, about the man in the wheelchair in the last room at the end of the hallway, about who he was, and about the way people were quietly pushing him toward death under the cover of a treatment protocol. She told him about Kessler, about Frey, about every unusual detail her trained eyes had noticed, and as she spoke, she saw Vale's face gradually change. He set his coffee cup down, pulled an old notebook from his briefcase, flipped quickly through pages crowded with handwritten notes, then stopped at one page and slid it across the table for her to see. He pointed to a name circled many times in ink and said that while tracing her husband's death, he had discovered that the construction site where he died was managed by a real estate company, and that company, after many layers of hidden fronts, ultimately belonged to the assets of the very man sitting paralyzed in the last room, at the end of the hallway she had just mentioned. Clara went still, and Vale went on, saying that what had kept him awake wasn't that fact, but the name of the man who had been in charge of the site when it happened, the man who signed the order to shut down and seal the elevator area immediately after the accident, the man who had been there arranging everything neatly before the police even arrived. He tapped his finger on the name in the notebook, and Clara looked down, and the name appearing beneath the yellow light made her breath catch. It was Kessler. For a moment, the entire cafe seemed to recede from her, leaving only that name striking her eyes, and the scattered pieces she had been keeping all this time began to find their proper places, with a coldness that made her shiver. The man tightening the net around Elias, the man who wanted to swallow his empire whole, was the very man who had been present at the place where her husband had fallen. She no longer saw her husband's death and the fate of the man in the wheelchair as two separate stories. They were two ends of the same thread, a red thread running through her entire life that she was only now able to see, and at the center of that thread was the face that always wore the courteous smile of Warren Kessler. Vale looked at her, saw the color drain from her face, and lowered his voice to warn her not to reveal anything, not to change the way she behaved at work, because if Kessler realized she was getting close to the truth, she and the child inside her would become a threat he needed to eliminate, and he had already shown he was willing to do it. But keeping her face calm wasn't always something she could control, and fate seemed determined to test her that very night. When Clara returned to Halden Care for her shift, she had barely pushed her cart around the bend in the hallway when she nearly collided with Kessler, who was standing there waiting, both hands in his pockets, his usual smile on his lips as though he had known in advance that she would arrive. He greeted her in that falsely sweet voice, asked whether she was feeling well tonight, then glanced down at her pregnant belly and said that women in her situation didn't have it easy, managing alone, working until late at night, speaking while his eyes stayed fixed on her face, studying every thread of reaction. He let a sentence hang in the air, saying he had heard that lately some retired detective had been wandering around asking questions about old matters, things that should have been left alone so the dead could rest in peace. Then he looked at her more closely and asked whether she had happened to meet anyone like that. Clara felt her heart pound, but she had spent years learning how to keep her hands from shaking beside Ed Zed's, where life and death stood close together, and she lifted her eyes to him with the tired, confused look of a poor woman, worried only about having enough money to give birth, answering that she hadn't met anyone at all, that she went to work and then went home, and that she had no strength left to concern herself with other people's affairs. Kessler looked at her for one long second more, then his smile widened. He nodded and said that was good, told her to take care of her health, and walked away. But only when his shadow disappeared around the corner did Clara dare lean against the wall and breathe out, one hand wrapped around her belly, and she knew that from this moment on, every step she took inside this building was walking along a fragile line between life and death. The truth came to Clara on an evening she hadn't expected at all, when she returned to the staff break room to retrieve the shawls she had forgotten, and heard Beth's voice drifting from behind the half-open door of the changing room. She was about to call out, but then she stopped, because Beth's voice now wasn't the warm voice she knew. It was trembling, pleading, speaking into the phone. Clara stood still, and every sentence, every word, slipped into her ears like needles. Beth was telling someone that she had done exactly as she had been asked, that she was still keeping an eye on the cleaning girl, that yes. Lately, Clara did seem to be lingering near the last room at the end of the hallway, and a few times she had seen Slira go outside to meet an older man. But she was begging the person on the other end not to make her do anything more, that she had only needed the money to finish paying the hospital bills, that she didn't want to be involved in hurting anyone. Then her voice caught, and Clara heard Beth say she was sorry, that she had no other choice, before hanging up. Clara pushed the door open and stepped inside, and Beth spun around, her face going white when she realized that the person who had just heard everything was Clara. For one long moment, neither of them said anything. There was only the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the two women standing face to face, with something newly broken between them that both of them knew could never be mended back to what it had been. Clara felt as though someone had just pulled away the last plank beneath her feet. Beth, the woman who had knitted a sweater for her child, the first person to treat her like a human being inside this cold building, the person she had begun to trust and see as a place of support, was the pair of eyes Kessler had planted to watch her. Clara asked Beth, her voice small but every word heavy, how long it had been when Beth had started reporting her every movement to him. Beth burst into tears. She collapsed onto the long bench, covered her face with both hands, and the confession poured out between sobs. She said the hospital debt had backed her into a corner, that the bank had sent warning letters, that she had exhausted every possible way to manage, and just when she was at her most desperate, Kessler came to her, offering to pay off that debt completely, in exchange for one thing that seemed harmless: to notice whether anyone at the nursing facility showed unusual concern for the man in the last room at the end of the hallway, and report it back to him. Beth said she had told herself it was only watching, that it wasn't hurting anyone, and she had tried to believe that so she could sleep at night, until the person she was assigned to watch turned out to be Clara, the only person in this building who had been kind to her, and that was when she realized what she had sold. She looked up at Clara through her tears, and said she hated herself every day, that she had meant to stop so many times. But whenever she thought about being unable to pay the debt, she lost her courage. Clara stood there, and inside her was a storm of emotions tearing against one another. There was the sharp sting of betrayal. There was the pain of knowing her trust had been used. But beneath all of that, she understood far too well the desperation that had driven Beth to this point, because she herself was standing on the same thin sheet of ice, because she too was haunted day and night by numbers, and by the fear of not being able to pay for the day her child was born. She knew that if she had been in Beth's place, with a child who needed medical care, she couldn't be certain she would have been strong enough to refuse. She didn't shout, she didn't curse her. She only sat down beside Beth, and after a long, heavy silence, she said softly that she understood, that she didn't blame Beth for being weak when she had been driven into a corner, because anyone in that situation could collapse. But then she took Beth's hand, looked straight into her eyes, and said that now Beth had to choose, that there were people in this building being quietly killed, little by little in silence. And Beth could keep closing her eyes and pretending not to see in order to hold on to her own safety. Or Beth could stand on the side of what was right, even though that would be much harder. Beth looked at her for a very long time, tears still rolling down her face, and in the woman's eyes, Clara saw a battle taking place between fear and conscience, between safety and what was right, and she knew that Beth's answer to this choice might change everything that was about to come. That night, the wind shifted, rain lashed against the windows of Halden Care in waves, and Clara was cleaning the middle corridor when the entire building was suddenly swallowed by darkness. The lights went out all at once, the familiar hum of machines and air conditioning stopped dead, and for the first few seconds there was only a thick silence and the sound of rain. Then the emergency lights, which should have come on, failed to glow, and that made Clara's instincts immediately sound an alarm, because she knew that in a medical facility, backup power was designed never to stop, and for the emergency lights to die along with everything else couldn't be a random malfunction. She stood still in the darkness for one beat, her heart pounding, and then a thought struck her so hard it sent coldness down her spine. The last room at the end of the hallway. The man whose life depended on the machines that were now quietly going dark. She dropped the cleaning cloth, felt for the small flashlight she always kept in her apron pocket, and switched it on, its weak, trembling circle of light, cutting a narrow path through the black hallway. She moved quickly toward the end. Her pregnant belly kept her from running, but she walked as fast as she could, and along the way, she realized something even more frightening. The unnatural emptiness, not a single nurse rushing toward the patient rooms in an emergency the way there should been, as if the entire night staff had been sent somewhere else at exactly this moment, leaving the whole corridor to her alone and the dark. That perfect arrangement told her this wasn't a power outage. This was a murder being staged to look like fate, and she was the only person who happened to be standing in the right place to witness it. She pushed open Elias's door, and the sweep of the flashlight made her heart tighten. The man was lying back on the bed, where the evening aide had moved him earlier, and in the flickering light, she saw that every sign of the dangerous episode she had once pulled him back from was returning, only this time more violently, and in circumstances far worse than before. His face was flushed red in the darkness, sweat pouring over his head and neck, his breath coming in harsh, strained rasps, and there was no machine working to monitor him now, no medication being pumped in to keep his blood pressure from surging toward a deadly threshold. The screen beside the bed was black. The IV had stopped dripping, everything had been cut off at once, and Clara understood immediately that someone had calculated exactly how long it would take this to kill him, that by the time anyone discovered him, it would all be over, and the file would say the patient had died during an unfortunate power failure, a natural death for a case that had already been hopeless. She set the flashlight upright on the bedside table so its beam fell across him, then placed 2 fingers against his neck, and the pulse beneath her hand was pounding so wildly that she felt real fear, a fear unlike anything she had known in all the emergencies of her life, because in those times she had always had machines, medicine, colleagues, light, but now she had only herself in the dark, with a 7-month pregnant belly and bare hands, facing death as it tightened its grip around the man before her. He tried to open his eyes and find her, and in those fading eyes she read that he understood what was happening too, that he knew this was the final blow they had struck against him, and, for one moment, there was something in his gaze, as if he wanted to tell her to leave him there, to save herself and the baby, not to die with him in this room. But Clara didn't leave. She drew in a deep breath, forced her own panic to quiet, pushed aside the fear and the ache pulling down her spine, and let the part of herself she had tried so long to bury rise completely to the surface, the part that knew exactly what to do when there was nothing left in her hands but knowledge and will. She raised the head of the bed with the manual crank, lifted his head higher, lowered the lower half of his body, repeating the only position that could hold back the blood surging upward toward his brain, and then she began searching for the cause that had set off the crisis, her fingers working in the flickering darkness, with a calm she hadn't known she still possessed. Outside, the rain kept beating against the glass. The building remained sunk in darkness and deathly silence, and in the small room lit by a single flashlight, a woman about to become a mother bent over a dying boss and began the longest, loneliest battle of her life to wrest him back from the hands of death. Clara found the trigger just as she suspected, and it was no accident. Someone had deliberately kinked his auxiliary oxygen line beneath the mattress. and shut off the backup IV flow regulator right before the blackout. She worked with hands that had stopped trembling, clearing the restricted airflow and restoring the vital line that was driving his body toward the edge. But this time, clearing the trigger still wasn't enough, because his blood pressure had climbed too high and stayed there too long, and there were no machines to tell her the exact number, no medicine to bring it down. All she had left was her own body and what she remembered. She loosened everything that was tightening around him, positioned his legs at the proper height, used her own hands to massage along both sides of his temples in a steady rhythm, to calm the nervous system that had fallen into chaos, and bent close to his ear, beginning to speak to him in that low, certain voice, telling him to breathe with her, telling him not to let go, and then she began to count. She counted backward, slowly, each number falling into the darkness like stepping stones for him to follow his way back, and she told him to hold on to her voice, to let each number pull him back little by little. He tried. She saw him trying, saw his chest struggling to breathe according to the rhythm she set, saw his fingers move faintly, as though reaching for something in the dark, and she placed her hand into his palm so he would have something to hold. He gripped her hand, weakly but with everything he had left, and Clara gripped his back, and like that, in a room lit only by the small glow of a flashlight, between the rain striking the window glass and the deathly silence of the whole building, two people the entire world had abandoned clung to each other through every number, every breath, every second. She lost all sense of time. At moments, her pregnant belly tightened with pain and made her grit her teeth. At moments, sweat ran into her eyes and stung them. At moments, her arm grew so exhausted she thought she wouldn't be able to lift it anymore. But she didn't stop. She didn't allow herself to stop, because she knew the moment she let go would be the moment they won. The moment that staged death completed its purpose. Then, in the most desperate moment, when the door opened softly, Clara's heart seemed to stop because she thought Kessler had returned to finish the job. But the beam of another flash swept in, and the voice that rose was Beth's. The woman stepped inside, breathing hard, a bag clutched in her arms, and in that moment Clara understood that Beth had made her choice. Beth said in broken breaths that she had seen the entire night staff sent downstairs for a ridiculous reason, that she had known at once something was wrong, and that she had slipped up here. She set the bag down, took out a manual blood pressure kit she had grabbed in a hurry from the nurse's station cabinet, and the two women, one nurse and one who had once been a nurse, bent together over the man in the flickering flashlight glow. Beth wrapped the cuff around him, and the number she read made them both look at each other in fear. But it had begun to inch downward, slowly but truly, responding to everything Clara had done through that long, endless stretch of time. Beth stood guard at the door to watch, ready to raise the alarm, while Clara kept holding him to the rhythm, kept counting, kept pulling him back. No one knew how long it had been when the ceiling lights suddenly flared on again, and the whole building shuddered back to life with the sound of machines starting up all at once. The bedside monitor blinked, then numbers appeared across the screen. The IV began dripping again, and the steady beeping of the monitor sounded like the most beautiful music Clara had ever heard. She looked up at the screen, saw that his blood pressure had returned to a safe range, that his heartbeat had become steady again, and only then did she allow herself to collapse against the side of the bed, her whole body shaking from exhaustion, one hand still gripping his, the other resting on her rising and falling pregnant belly. She had held him, in the dark, alone, with nothing but her bare hands and a will that refused to let go. She had dragged him back from death's hands one more time. Elias opened his eyes. He looked at her, at the woman who had stayed awake through an entire battle for him, her face hollow with exhaustion, her hair damp and stuck to her skin with sweat. And in his eyes now, there was nothing left of the cold beast the whole building feared. There was only a wordless tenderness and a gratitude so deep no language could hold it. He tried to move the fingers still enclosed in her hand, squeezing faintly, and in a hoarse voice that sounded nearly broken apart, he rasped a few words, saying she shouldn't have stayed, that she should run. Clara lifted her head, her own eyes blurring too, and answered softly that she had already told him. She had never been capable of walking away from someone who was drowning, and now he had to live, not only for himself, but because there were too many questions only he could answer. Outside in the hallway, footsteps began to stir as the staff hurried back in panic, and Beth quickly cleaned away the traces. But inside that last room, among the machines that had just come back to life, 3 people who had just fought together against a carefully arranged death had quietly become allies, bound by a secret they would have to carry together from that night on. 2 days after the blackout, Vale called Clara and asked to meet her at their usual cafe, and when she arrived, she knew at once that something in him had changed, because his face no longer carried the cautious, searching look of their earlier meetings, but the heaviness of a man about to hand over something he had kept for far too long. He placed a yellowed envelope on the table, its edges worn soft, and told her in a low voice that while going back through the files, he had found this among her husband's personal effects. The belongings the construction site had turned over, but that had never reached her. It had been caught inside a folder of papers and forgotten. He said he had struggled for a long time over whether to give it to her, but he believed she had the right to know, and that perhaps the time had come. Clara took the envelope, and she recognized the handwriting immediately, her husband's handwriting, with her name written across the front, a letter he had written but had never gotten the chance to send. She didn't open it in the cafe. She couldn't. She carried it with her, keeping it in her pocket through her entire shift at the restaurant, her hand touching it again and again through the fabric. And it wasn't until late that night, after she crossed over to Halden Care and found a quiet moment in the empty changing room, that she sat down on the long bench, drew in a deep breath, and opened the letter beneath the light. His familiar handwriting appeared before her, and from the very first lines, tears rose in her eyes. He wrote that if she was reading these words, then something had probably happened to him, and he was sorry for keeping it from her. He wrote that he had accepted a job he couldn't tell her about, that a powerful man had quietly come to him and asked him to serve as his eyes and ears inside one of his construction projects, because he suspected someone beneath him was stealing, doing crooked business, and betraying him, and her husband was one of the few people he still believed he could trust. He wrote that he had agreed because the money was enough to give her and their unborn child a decent beginning, because all he had wanted was to give the 2 of them a better life. Then the voice of the letter grew more urgent, as though he had written it in haste and fear. He wrote that he had discovered something big enough to make the other man kill to silence him, that he had gathered evidence and hidden it somewhere safe, and that if anything happened to him, she should believe that he had tried to do the right thing. The final lines of the letter made Clara collapse completely, both hands covering her face, the tears she had held back for 4 months breaking loose now, with no way to stop them. He wrote that he loved her, that he loved the child he hadn't gotten to meet, and that he was sorry he couldn't be there to watch that child grow up. She sat there in the silent changing room, holding the letter to her chest, crying for the husband who had died, carrying a secret meant to protect her, crying for the child who would never hear its father's voice, crying for everything she had lost, without even being allowed to know why, not until tonight. And when her sobs finally quieted, a cold truth rose clearly in her mind, fitting the final piece into the picture she had been following for so long. The powerful man who had placed her husband inside as his eyes and ears, the man whose secret her husband had died trying to protect, was no one else but Elias Thornberry. The man in the wheelchair in the last room at the end of the hallway, the man she had twice wrestled back from the hands of death. The man her husband had investigated and been killed by was Kessler, the same man now tightening the net around Elias. All of them, she, her husband Elias, were pieces on the same chessboard, all victims of the same man, and fate had bound them together with threads she could only now see in full. Clara wiped her tears, folded the letter carefully, and pressed it against her chest, and inside her, amid the deepest pain she had just lived through, something hardened into resolve. Elias, even if not directly, still owed her a life, owed her child a father, and she understood that this fight was no longer only about saving an abandoned patient. It had become her own fight for her husband, for her child, and for the truth he had traded his life to protect. The following night, Clara entered Elias's room with her husband's letter pressed inside her coat pocket, and a burning question in her heart that she knew she couldn't carry for even one more day. She closed the door behind her, stood silently for a while beside his bed, then took out the letter, placed it on the blanket covering his legs, and asked him directly, her voice trembling but not turning away, whether he had known a worker the man she had married, whether he had been the one who planted her husband inside the construction site to serve as his eyes and ears. She saw Elias's reaction before he could speak a single word, saw his eyes close for a moment, as though an old wound had just been touched, and that alone answered her. He knew. He had recognized her the exact moment she whispered those 3 words, realizing she was not only the nurse who had saved him a year ago, but also the wife of the man who had died because of him. Elias opened his eyes, and he didn't try to evade her. In that hoarse, labored voice, with every sound demanding effort, he admitted that yes, he had gone to her husband, that he had needed someone on the inside whom the traitors wouldn't suspect, an ordinary, honest man, someone with no ties to his world, and her husband had been that kind of man. He said he had promised to protect him, had believed he was powerful enough to shelter one human life, but he had been wrong. He had underestimated the man he was hunting, and by the time Kessler discovered the truth, it was already too late. He stopped, his breathing heavy, then went on to say something Clara had never imagined she would hear from a man like him, that on the night he was betrayed and collapsed. He had no idea the nameless nurse who saved him on the emergency table was the very wife her husband had spoken of to him with such pride, and that when he recognized her in this building, that truth had tormented him every day even more than the paralysis of his body. Clara stood there, and inside her, 2 opposite currents of feeling rose and tore against each other. One part of her wanted to pour all her anger onto this man, wanted to ask whether he understood that he had taken a father from her child, that because of his misplaced trust and his war for power, she had become a widow before she had even had the chance to become a mother. But another part of her, the part that had sat beside him through long nights, that had seen his humiliation when he couldn't feed himself even one spoonful of porridge, that had held his hand and pulled him back from death, couldn't bring herself to call the man before her an enemy. Her voice catching, she asked him what she was supposed to do with him, whether she should hate him or pity him, because she no longer knew how to tell the difference between the two. And Elias, perhaps for the first time in his life, didn't give the answer of a powerful man. He only looked at her, his eyes, the same eyes that had once made an entire city tremble, now brimming with tears, and said he wasn't asking her to forgive him, because he knew there were debts that could never be repaid. He was asking her for only one thing, the chance to protect her and the baby, to finish the thing he had promised her husband and had failed to do, even if it was the last thing he ever did in this world. The room sank into silence, with only the steady beeping of the monitor and the sound of the rain that had stopped, leaving droplets still clinging to the window glass. Clara looked at the man lying there, the lower half of his body dead still, his hands trembling, the man who had just confessed his helplessness before a poor woman he normally should never have had to notice. And she understood that his words were not those of a crime lord trying to buy a person's loyalty, but those of a human being trying to redeem some small part of what had been broken because of him. She bent down, picked up the letter from the blanket, folded it again, and said softly that she couldn't forgive him yet, that perhaps it would take a very long time, or perhaps it would never happen, but she also couldn't leave him to die in the hands of the men who had killed her husband, because if she did, then his death would become meaningless. She said her husband had died to expose the truth, and she would live to finish that work, and if Elias truly wanted to make amends, then he had to help her, not for his own sake, but for her husband's. Elias nodded, slowly and heavily, and in that nod there was a promise sealed by everything that remained of a man who had once had everything, and then lost everything. From that night on, the bond between them was no longer the bond between a savior and someone indebted to her. It had become something deeper, tied together by a shared loss and a shared enemy, and both of them understood that the road ahead would demand more from them than everything they had already endured. After the night of the blackout, something inside Elias had awakened again, and Clara recognized it in the way he began giving orders. He was no longer the man who sat there in resignation, waiting for others to decide his fate. Every night when she entered his room, he handed her a scrap of paper covered with writing that still trembled but had grown more decisive, brief instructions for her to pass to Otto, and through a line of communication made up of a cleaning woman and an old bodyguard, the boss imprisoned inside a paralyzed body began moving his pieces across a chessboard. Kessler had believed he was playing alone, Elias told Otto to quietly reach out to a few men who had once sworn loyalty to him but had remained silent and waiting, to tell them not to act rashly, only to hold their positions and wait for the signal. He told Otto to follow the money, to find the accounts Kessler had been quietly draining, and he calculated every step with the cold precision of a man who had once built an entire empire from nothing but his own 2 hands. One evening, as Clara helped him drink water, he signaled for her to bend closer, and in his hoarse, broken voice, he explained it to her, not to boast, but because he wanted her to understand where she stood in this game. He said Kessler couldn't simply kill him and seize everything, because most of his real assets, the things of greatest value, were locked behind layers of security that only he himself controlled, passwords, signatures, agreements, that no one could touch without his own consent, not even if he were dead. That was the reason he was still alive, he said, not because Kessler had any loyalty left in him, but because Kessler needed him to seek the transfer documents while he was still conscious and still legally considered competent. A corpse was useless to him. He needed Elias alive, awake, but weak enough and desperate enough to put pen to paper. And that narrow opening, he said, with a cold flash of light in his eyes, was what he would use to overturn the board. But Kessler wasn't the kind of man to sit still and wait to be overturned. And he too had begun to smell that something was slipping out of his control. After the failed blackout, after the prey who should have died was still alive, he understood that someone inside was working against him, and he decided not to drag the game out any longer. One afternoon, he entered Elias's room with a thick stack of documents and a lawyer beside him carrying a notarial seal, and this time the courteous smile that usually stayed on his lips had given way to a cold impatience. He placed the documents on the table in front of Elias and said it was time to end all the delays, that because his boss's health was getting worse by the day, it would be best to transfer him to a specialized care facility far from the city, where he could rest quietly, and in order to do that, he only needed to sign the papers granting Kessler authority to manage his assets while he recovered. He said all of it in the sweet voice of a man offering a favor, but everyone in the room understood what it truly meant. Once Elias was taken to that distant place, with no Clara, no Otto, no one to witness anything, he would never come back. Elias looked at the documents, then lifted his eyes to the face of the man who had once been his right hand, and in a moment so tense it nearly stopped the air, Clara stood wiping the corner of the room and felt her heart seem to stop. But Elias didn't panic. He let the silence stretch long enough for Kessler to begin growing uneasy. Then he spoke, one slow word at a time, saying he would sign. Kessler let a flash of triumph show for an instant, but Elias went on, saying that he would sign, but not today, because under the exact legal terms Kessler himself had helped him draft years ago, a transfer of assets on this scale required the presence of an independent trust administrator as a witness, or it would be invalid in court. He said it with the calm of a man who understood the rules of the game better than anyone, and Clara saw the smile on Kessler's lips stiffen, because he knew Elias was right, and he knew Elias had just bought himself a precious measure of time. But when Kessler gathered the documents back up, his eyes narrowed into a cold, sharp line, and he said softly, almost in a whisper, that his boss had 3 days, no more, and that after those 3 days, with or without a witness, everything would be completed one way or another. He left the room, and in the silence that remained, Elias turned to look at Clara. Both of them understood that the clock had just begun counting down, and they had only 3 days left to bring down a man who had spent months preparing for this move. 3 days, and Clara knew they couldn't waste even 1 hour. So that very night she called Vale, and they met in his old car parked out of sight in the alley behind the nursing facility, where Vale had spread across the back seat an entire file of documents he had gathered over the past several months. He told her that he had followed the money Kessler used to bribe people, and there was one thing he still couldn't make sense of, one thing that had troubled him from the beginning. Those payments didn't come from Kessler's accounts. They passed through a string of shell companies, but when he patiently peeled back each layer, all of them led back to the same point of origin, and the name behind that origin wasn't Kessler. Vale handed Clara a sheet of paper, pointed to the name at the bottom, and when she read it, a chill went through her whole body, because it was the name she heard every day inside that building, the name of the man in the white coat who always declared in his flat voice that the patient in the last room at the end of the hallway was a hopeless case. Aldous Frey, and in that very instant, all the scattered pieces Clara had unknowingly picked up over so many days suddenly found their rightful places. The file about ownership and asset portfolios she had glimpsed on Frey's desk the day he summoned her up to threaten her, something an ordinary treating physician had no reason to keep. The phone call he had hurriedly turned face down, before lowering his voice to say it wasn't finished yet, that they needed more time. The way he was always the one to declare that Elias was beyond recovery, always the one signing the medical notes stating there had been no progress, always the one blocking every chance for Elias to be assessed again. All this time, Clara had been certain Frey was only a puppet Kessler had paid to look the other way, a cowardly accomplice who had been bought, but the truth was the complete opposite. Kessler hadn't hired Frey. Frey was the one who had been standing behind all of it from the start. Vale pieced the whole picture together for her in the heavy, low voice of a man who had just seen through a conspiracy far deeper than he had imagined. He said Frey had knowledge, status, and the respectable cover of a doctor no one would think to suspect, but beneath that cover was a man who hungered for Elias's vast fortune and was patient enough to weave a perfect trap. Frey was the one who had understood that if he wanted to swallow Elias's empire whole, he couldn't rely on simple violence. He had to make Elias appear incompetent. He had to confine him inside a medical facility under the name of treatment, and he had to find someone within Elias's own ranks who was greedy enough to betray him. That person was Kessler. Frey and Kessler weren't master and servant. They were two equal conspirators, each holding half of the puzzle. Kessler had power and a network inside Elias's organization, while Frey had the white coat and the medical facility where a person could be made to disappear while everything still looked legal. They needed each other, and they had joined hands to divide the empire they had brought down together. Clara sat silently in the car, her breath fogging the cold glass, and she felt the weight on her shoulders double. All this time, she had thought she only had one enemy to face, Kessler, a man she could at least anticipate. Now she understood that the more dangerous enemy was the man she faced every day, the man with full authority inside the building, the man who could issue any medical order for Elias and go unquestioned, the man who could decide who lived and who died with a single signed page. She thought of the 3 days Kessler had just given them, and she realized that deadline hadn't been set by Kessler alone, but was the result of coordination between two men who had calculated every possible move. Vale gripped her shoulder and reminded her that they were now up against something twice as dangerous, that one small mistake could make her, the baby, Elias, and even Vale himself pay the price, and that if they wanted to bring both of these men down, they needed evidence, the evidence her husband had died to protect, and had hidden somewhere safe. Clara looked out into the darkness beyond the glass, one hand resting on her belly, and inside her, fear and resolve braided together into a feeling she had never known before. Because she understood that to protect her unborn child, and finish what her husband had left undone, she would have to step into direct confrontation with two men, each of whom had the power to crush her, and she had only 3 days to find the thing that could save them all. On the second night of those 3 fateful days, Clara left her shift at Ambrose Hall later than usual. And when she went down into the underground parking garage beneath the building to get her old car, she sensed at once that something was wrong. The neon lights overhead flickered weakly. The garage was almost empty, with only a few scattered cars left behind, and the sound of her footsteps echoed across the concrete in a hollow, lonely way. She walked faster, one hand supporting her belly, her keys already gripped in her hand, but just as she came near her car, a figure stepped out from behind a pillar, and before she could react, she recognized the face, Kessler. He stood between her and the car, both hands in his pockets, his usual courteous smile completely gone, replaced by a deadly coldness, and beside him stood a large, powerfully built man, silent as a shadow. Kessler said in an even voice that he had been patient with her long enough, that he knew exactly who she was, knew she wasn't an ordinary cleaning woman, knew she had been secretly communicating with the old retired detective, and with the remnants still loyal to Elias. He told her he also knew she was the one who had ruined the night when everything should have ended cleanly. Clara stood still, her heart pounding, but she forced herself not to reveal her fear, because she understood that with a man like Kessler, the panic of prey would only make him more confident. She asked him what he wanted, her voice holding an astonishing calm, and Kessler gave a cold laugh, saying he wanted to use her. He said Elias had become inexplicably stubborn these past few days, that he had invented every possible reason to delay signing the papers, and Kessler had realized the reason was none other than Clara, that the man wouldn't put pen to paper as long as he still had hope. And the fastest way to extinguish a person's hope was to take away the thing that person wanted to protect. The large man stepped closer, and Clara knew she had no way out. She couldn't run with a 7-month pregnant belly. She couldn't fight off 2 men, and any reckless move now would only put her and her child in greater danger. So she didn't resist. She let them put her into the back seat of a black car, and throughout the ride, instead of panicking, she forced her mind to work, to observe, to remember. She counted the turns the car made, listened to the sounds outside, and the distant echo of a train whistle told her they were heading toward the harbor district, the place that, according to rumors, had once belonged to Elias. She placed a hand on her belly, felt the child stir faintly, and whispered in her mind that Mommy would get the baby out of here, that the baby should stay calm with her. And it was the very mission of staying calm for her child that kept her from collapsing beneath her fear. They took her into an old abandoned warehouse by the harbor, damp and dark, and seated her on a chair beneath the only light. Kessler called someone, and through that call, Clara understood that he was telling Frey the bargaining chip was now in his hands, that now they would use her to force Elias to sign. She understood that she had very little time, but she also understood something Kessler may have forgotten, that as long as they still needed her as a hostage to pressure Elias, they wouldn't dare harm her, because a dead hostage had no bargaining value. Her life and her child's life had now become the very card keeping her safe, and she had to stretch that value as long as possible while waiting for an opening. So she began buying time in the only way she knew. She let her breathing grow quick, brought a hand to her belly, and gave a soft groan. She performed the signs of pregnancy distress convincingly enough, using the very medical knowledge she understood better than anyone. In a broken voice, she said she was showing signs of early labor, that if they kept her under this kind of stress, the baby could be in danger. And she saw the large man glance at Kessler in confusion, because even the cruelest men hesitated at the thought of taking responsibility for the death of a pregnant woman and a child, something that would turn the matter from a quiet arrangement into an uncontrollable storm. Kessler watched her suspiciously, but she described the symptoms with such precision that he couldn't be sure, and that hesitation was exactly what she needed. She asked for a cup of water, asked to lie down, each request stretching out 1 more minute, and while outwardly she appeared to be a weak, frightened pregnant woman in distress, inside, her eyes never stopped scanning the warehouse, memorizing the location of every door, every exit, and silently waiting for the moment she firmly believed would come, the moment when Elias and the others would not leave her behind, while Clara was buying time in the dark warehouse by the harbor, in the last room at the end of the hallway at Halden Care. Elias received the news that she had been taken through a phone call Kessler deliberately let him hear, his voice sweetly announcing that the hostage was waiting for his boss's signature. But instead of breaking down the way Kessler had calculated, something inside that paralyzed man hardened into steel. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. He only silently signaled to Otto, the man he had secretly arranged to keep watch nearby for the past several days, precisely in case this situation came, and an entire plan he had quietly spread into place began to move. Because Elias had predicted that when driven to the end of the road, Kessler would use a hostage, and he had prepared for that move days before, just as he had prepared for every other move throughout his life. What neither Kessler nor Frey knew was that during the weeks Clara had patiently helped him practice every night, Elias's hands had recovered far more than he had allowed anyone to see. He had deliberately hidden that progress, continuing to play the part of an almost helpless man in front of his enemies, keeping it as his final card, and now it was time to use it. When Kessler's 2 men were sent to his room to escort him away to sign the papers, they pushed his wheelchair out into the large lobby of the building, and it was there, under the bright lights in the middle of the lobby, that Elias did something that left everyone stunned. He placed both hands on the rims of the wheels himself, and with a strength no one believed he possessed, he held the chair still. Then he slowly pushed it around until he was facing the 2 men fully, lifted his head, and looked straight at them with the cold, razor-sharp eyes of the man who had once ruled this entire territory. That gaze, that authority they had thought had died with his legs, suddenly came alive again in full in that moment, and the two men, though tall and strong, instinctively faltered, as if the memory of the man they had once feared had risen up and stopped them in their tracks. That brief hesitation was all Elias needed. His hand, the hand he had quietly trained back into obedience bit by bit, slipped down beside the wheelchair, where Otto had secretly installed an emergency alarm button connected directly to the line Vale had arranged, and he pressed it. At once, the building's alarm screamed through the air, red emergency lights flashed across the hallways, and the entire nursing facility woke into chaos. But that wasn't all, because Vale, who had been waiting for this signal all night, hadn't acted alone. Over the past several days, with the file Clara's husband had left behind, combined with the evidence he and Otto had gathered, Vale had reached out to old, trustworthy people still in the force, people willing to listen to a case that should never have been closed. And now, when the signal rang out, police vehicles rushed in at the same time at both places, Halden Care and the warehouse by the harbor whose location Otto had managed to trace. In the warehouse, Clara heard the sound of sirens echoing from far away, drawing closer and closer, and she saw Kessler's face change. He shouted at his men and tried to drag her to her feet so he could escape, but the false calm of a weak, frightened pregnant woman that she had performed for hours had made him misjudge the situation and miss his chance to run. Headlights flashed through the broken windows. The thunder of footsteps filled the warehouse, and in that chaos Clara did exactly what she had been waiting to do. She rolled off the chair, ducked behind a stack of old wooden crates, and wrapped both arms tightly around her belly to protect her child, pulling herself out of Kessler's reach, just as the police flooded inside. Kessler was surrounded in the middle of the warehouse, and in the final moment, when he realized every path had been blocked, the courteous mask he had worn for so long fell away completely, revealing beneath it nothing more than a greedy man who had lost everything in the very game he had believed he was certain to win. As for Frey, the true originator behind it all, when he heard the alarm ringing throughout Halden Care and knew the plan had collapsed, he tried to do what men like him always do when the ship begins to sink. He tried to slip away quietly. He hastily gathered the asset documents from his desk, the file he had spent months preparing, and tried to leave the building through the back exit. But at that very doorway he found Vale waiting, with police officers beside him. Vale looked at the doctor in the white coat, the man who had hidden so perfectly behind the cover of respectability all this time, and said only one brief sentence, that the game was over. Frey stood frozen, the file in his hands, the thing that was supposed to hand him an entire empire, now nothing more than the evidence that would condemn him. And that night, as the police sirens slowly quieted and dawn began to break faintly along the horizon over the lake, the two men who had woven together a perfect conspiracy to steal one man's life and empire were finally led away into the light, brought down not by a greater force, but by the persistence of an old investigator, the loyalty of a bodyguard, the will of a boss who refused to bow, and above all, by the courageous heart of a woman they had underestimated. The days after the night at the harbor passed like a flood, sweeping away every lie Frey and Kessler had worked so hard to build. The file Clara's husband had hidden, the thing he had traded his life to protect, was finally found by Vale in the place where he had concealed it, and inside was everything needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. There were pieces of footage people had believed they had erased, bank statements showing money flowing through shell companies before gathering in Frey's pocket, and even recordings of conversations between the two conspirators discussing how to make a person disappear under the name of medical treatment. When all that evidence was placed on the investigators' table, not one layer of their disguise could hold anymore. They discovered that the medical notes Frey had signed for months, the reports insisting that the patient in the last room at the end of the hallway had no chance of recovery, were all falsified, written not according to Elias's true condition, but for the purpose of keeping him confined under the appearance of incompetence, so it would be easier to seize his assets. They found that the medications meant to help him recover had been deliberately withheld or replaced, that opportunities for therapy had been blocked, that an entire treatment plan had been designed not to heal him, but to keep him broken. and when independent specialists were brought in to reassess Elias, they concluded that his injury had never been as hopeless as Frey had claimed, that, if he had received proper treatment from the beginning, he could have recovered far more than he had. That truth made people shudder at the cruelty of a man who had used the white coat and the oath to save lives to do the very opposite. Kessler and Frey were arrested and faced a series of charges, from conspiracy to seize assets and falsifying records to far more serious offenses connected to the death they had caused. But what brought Clara closest to tears wasn't the sight of those two men being led away. It was the day the file on her husband's death was officially reopened. The thing that for the past 4 months had been stamped as an unfortunate workplace accident, the careless label that had left her to carry her grief alone without even an explanation, was finally brought back under the light of truth. They confirmed that her husband hadn't been careless, hadn't made a mistake, that he had died because he had uncovered a crime and refused to stay silent, that he was an upright man who had dared to stand against powerful people to protect what was right. His name was cleared, and to Clara, that meant more than any punishment given to the criminals, because now, when her child grew up, she would be able to tell that child that its father hadn't been an unlucky man who had fallen because of a mistake, but a brave man who had sacrificed himself for justice. And then it was Clara's turn to be given back something she had lost long ago. During the investigation, as her role in saving Elias's life and exposing the entire conspiracy gradually came to light, people also learned about her past, learned that the woman the whole nursing facility had once seen as a nameless cleaning worker had in fact once been a gifted emergency nurse who had quietly left the profession because of a wound in her heart. Her former colleagues at Mercy General came to see her, and the hospital officially invited her to return, not out of pity, but as a late recognition of the skill and compassion she had never truly lost. Clara sat in her small apartment, one hand resting on her belly, her husband's letter lying on the table beside her, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt the burden that had pressed on her shoulders all this time being lifted away. The storm had passed. Those who had committed the crimes had paid the price. The innocent had been cleared, and the woman who had once believed she no longer had the right to touch another person's life now stood before the door of a new beginning. But she knew there was still one thing unfinished, still one person waiting for her in the last room at the end of the hallway, the man fate had bound to her life with threads that could not be untied, and she understood that the final chapter of this story had not yet been written. After the sinners had been led away, and the truth had been brought into the light, Elias was transferred to a real rehabilitation center, where for the first time since the day of the accident, he was treated by people who wanted him to recover, not people who wanted him to remain broken. And Clara, though she had accepted the offer to return to her profession, still came to visit him regularly, because she understood that his journey had only just begun, and she couldn't leave him halfway down the road she herself had pulled him back onto. Elias's therapy sessions were another kind of war, quieter but no less brutal than everything they had already endured. He gripped the parallel bars with the hands that had recovered, straining with all his strength to lift his body. And in those first attempts, the legs that had once lain dead beneath him trembled and buckled, sweat soaking through him, his face twisting with pain and with the discouragement of a man who had once stood at the peak of power, and now had to relearn from the beginning something even a child could do. There were moments when he wanted to let go, and in those moments, Clara sat down beside him, offering no empty words, only reminding him that he had come this far, and there was no reason to stop now. Then, one winter afternoon, as pale sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the therapy room, Elias released the parallel bars, braced himself on a cane, and he walked. The first step was slow and trembling, his whole body swaying as though he might fall, but he held himself up, then he took a second step, and a third, each one a victory wrested back from fate. Each one the strongest answer to everyone who had ever called him hopeless. Clara stood at the far end of the room watching him come toward her, and she couldn't hold back her tears, because she was witnessing what no one at Halden Care that year had dared believe possible. The man an entire building had abandoned in silence was now walking on his own legs. When he reached her, he stopped, breathing hard, and looked at her with a smile she had never seen on that face before. The smile of a man who had found not only his legs again but himself. Not long after that, it was Clara's turn to enter a trial of her own. She went into labor on a night when snow fell thick outside, and she was not alone, because Beth stayed by her side from the first wave of pain, holding her hand, encouraging her through each contraction with all the devotion of someone who was both a friend and a colleague. And when the baby's first cry rang out in the delivery room, when they placed that tiny new life in her arms, Clara broke down sobbing, a cry of happiness bursting open, after all the loss and fear she had passed through. She looked at her child's face and found there the features of the husband she had lost, and she whispered to the baby that its father had been a brave man, that it had been born from his love and courage. A few days later, after she had come home, Beth brought June to visit, and the little girl tiptoed close to the cradle, her round eyes staring at the sleeping baby, wearing the yellow sweater whose color she herself had chosen. Then June looked up and proudly declared that she had said so. Yellow was like the sun, so the baby would always feel warm. The small room filled with laughter. And in that moment, among people who had once walked together through darkness, new life rose like a promise that all suffering would one day make room for light. Elias came to visit Clara and the baby when the child was a few weeks old. He walked in on his own with his cane, and when he bent down to look at the baby's face, Clara saw tears glistening in his eyes. He stood silently beside the cradle for a long while, then lifted his head to look at her, and in a voice that had grown clear again, he softly said those familiar words to her, "Count with me." But this time, when Clara smiled and began to count, she didn't count backward the way she had on the night she held him back from the edge. This time she counted forward, beginning with 1, then 2, then 3. Each number no longer a thread pulling someone away from death, but the first steps toward what lay ahead, toward a new life opening for all of them. The man who had once been abandoned by the whole world, and the woman who had once believed she had lost everything, stood together beside the cradle of a newborn life, counting toward the future. And in that small, warm room in the middle of a white winter, 3 generations of a family not joined by blood, but bound by things far stronger than blood, finally found the peaceful place each of them had once believed they would never have. 1 year after the fateful night at Halden Care, Elias Thornbury had become a different man, not because he was able to walk again on his own legs, but because the way he understood power and the value of a human life had changed at the root. He didn't return to the underworld he had once ruled. Instead, he used the lawful portion of the fortune he had recovered to establish a foundation named after Clara's late husband, a foundation created to support 2 kinds of people whose lives had been tied to his own in opposite ways. Patients quietly abandoned by the system and the families of workers who had lost their pillars to workplace accidents. Whenever someone asked why a man like him would do such a thing, he often said that he had spent half his life making other people fear him, and he had come to understand that such power hadn't saved him on the night he lay waiting to die in the last room at the end of the hallway. The only thing that saved him had come from a woman who had no power at all except a heart that refused to abandon another human being. As for Clara, she returned to the white coat she had once believed she no longer had the right to wear, but she didn't return to the same place she had left. With support from Elias Foundation, she took the lead in a program she named Second Look, a program devoted to finding patients who had been declared hopeless, people others had stopped fighting for, and giving them one more chance to be seen again, heard again, and given one more moment of hope. She understood better than anyone that sometimes the line between a hopeless case and a life saved lay only in whether someone was willing to stop, willing to look more closely, willing to believe that a person's silence didn't mean they had surrendered. Every time she sat beside an abandoned patient and took their hand, she saw the shadow of the man in the wheelchair from that year-long past, and she knew the work she was doing wasn't only saving strangers. It was also healing the wound inside her, the wound that had once driven her to leave her calling in despair. If there is one thing their story leaves behind, it is the reminder that a person's dignity is not measured by the position they hold, the degree they carry, or the wealth they possess. A powerful boss lying paralyzed in a wheelchair, and a poor pregnant waitress cleaning floors at night, by every measure society uses, stood at opposite ends of life, and yet they were the ones who saved each other. They gave back to each other the most precious thing each had lost. He gave her back her faith in herself, and she gave him back not only his life, but a reason to live with decency. Because sometimes in this life, the person we reach out to save and the person who comes back to save us turn out to be the same person. And the kindness we give in silence, believing it has fallen into emptiness, will one day find its way back to us at the very moment we need it most. Every human being, even one the whole world calls hopeless, a burden, or dangerous, still deserves to have someone believe they are worth fighting for. And so the story of the man in the last room at the end of the hallway and the woman who refused to walk away came to a close, not with a final period, but with numbers being counted forward. Because for them, everything had truly only just begun. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share, so you can listen to many more meaningful stories every day. We would truly love to know how you felt about today's story, what moved you the most, so please leave a few lines in the comments to share the feelings deep inside your heart, because every word you send is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very last lines. May you, the person watching this video, always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and safety in every passing day. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in the next stories.